Okay, I think that will do. Welcome, everybody, to this evening's research seminar for the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. I'm Tony Burns. I'm one of the three co-directors of the Centre, and I'm going to be chairing this evening's session. Our speaker is Charisse Burden-Stelly, who's an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University, and she's currently a visiting scholar at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. She's the co-author with Gerald Home of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, which was published in 2019. She's contributed to Percy C. Hinson's volume Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Colonial State, Postcolonial State, which was published in 2022. She's co-editor with Jody Dean of Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writings, which was published by Verso in 2022. And most recently of all, she's the author of Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2023. She's also published numerous articles in various academic journals, which I won't go into, and a number of popular publications in outlets such as Boston Review and Nation, Teen Vogue, Black Perspectives, and so on and so forth. Charisse is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace as well. She's going to be talking this evening. The title of her talk is Theorizing Black Anti-Fascist Thought, 1947 to 1967. And presumably it's based on her recent book. We'll finish at 7:30. Charisse will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a similar amount of time for discussion. Okay, Charisse, over to you.
Hello, all. So just a couple of caveats. One is that, as I was telling Tony, I have my child here, so I'm currently pushing her back and forth in the stroller. So I may have to just engage her. So apologies for that. Such is life. And secondly, I actually have sort of shifted slightly the focus of my talk. It's actually just called Theorizing U.S. Radical Black Thought, 1947 to 1967. And it's actually the project that I'm working on now as a fellow at the Charles Warren Center. Sort of a side project. I'm actually finishing up my second book on mutual comradeship. So this project that I'll talk about is really in its embryonic stages. And so since this is sort of a seminar on new works, I thought I'd share a bit about this particular project. So the project is tentatively titled Antecedents of Black Power in the McCarthyist Conjuncture, and it seeks to analyze and explicate the parallels in U.S. radical Black thought, political and social, thought and theory in the period spanning roughly 1947 and 1957, or what I call the McCarthyist Conjuncture, in 1966 to 1978, or the Black Power era. As Peniel Joseph asserts, the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s has its antecedents in a new Negro radicalism during the interwar period and continuing through freedom surges of the World War II era. But more than this, there are striking ideological and analytical continuities, resonances, and consistencies between political thought and analyses of the Black Power era and this McCarthyist conjuncture, which in turn has much of its ideological roots in the 1930s. Here, I'm engaging in a comparative conjunctural analysis. Conjunctural analysis can be broadly defined as the analysis of convergent and divergent tendencies shaping the totality of power relations within a given social field during a particular period of time. It analyzes the interplay of the cultural, political, and economic in a cluster of social forces and discourses that lead to a new common sense. A conjuncture is a politically significant level at which historical situations must be analyzed in terms of the relative strength of the different social interests competing within a given social field, and is less permanent than its historically enduring underlying conditions. Moreover, according to Lawrence Grossberg, quote, conjunctural analysis involves a strategic political choice to work at a particular level of abstraction. Conjunctures define a particular site, perhaps the most effective site for a political intervention, aimed at redirecting the tides of change, and perhaps the most propitious level at which intellectual and political analysis converge. This is the level of the social formation as some sort of totality, however fragile and temporary. It is located between the specificity of the moment and the long durée of the epoch. End quote. In centering radical Black political and social thought, particularly that emanating from, adjacent to, and in conversation with the Communist Party USA, its linked organizations, and its afterlives, I seek to challenge the hard and fast distinction between the old left and the new left. One author appears to assume, for example, that there are no relevant Black people to the old left. It is only with the interest of people like Eldridge Cleaver, Bobby Seale, and Stokely Carmichael that Black people became a recognizable leftist force. And of course, if we center radical Black thought, we can see that this is clearly not the case. Examining residences in, for example, periodicals like Freedom and Triple Jeopardy, organizations like the National Negro Labor Council and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, in theories of imperialism, fascism, self-determination, and triple oppression, and the uses of the court as political theater, in interrogations of political frame-ups and legal lynchings, and in the political thought of a long-distance revolutionary like Harry Haywood, the relationship between these two conjunctures, which are too frequently engaged as discrete containers of knowledge and theorizing, becomes quite clear. Bringing these two together might also help us rethink other supposed differences between the old and new left. For example, one distinction is that the base of the old left was solidly industrial working class, while the base of the new left was primarily young and educated. However, radical Black folks who belonged to the Communist Party challenged this idea in that they tended to be toilers, workers, and petty bourgeois intellectuals alike. While somebody like Harold Cruz saw serious flaws with the latter group in their relationship with the CPUSA, in fact, they were modeling early on a praxis of class suicide and a non-elitist racial vanguardism. It also highlights the role of formerly educated people, professors, and students in movements prior to the 1960s. Likewise, comparing these two conjunctures allows us to lift up characteristics in one that were thought to only pertain to the other. One such characteristic is cultural revolution. If it is true that the history of every modern revolution has included a cultural revolution of some sort or another, then one could argue that thinkers like Claudia Jones and Louise Thompson Patterson were calling for a cultural revolution as much as a political and economic one. For instance, when they implored white men to dance with Black women at party functions, this was as much about cultivating a culture of comradeship as it was about political solidarity. While not as seismic as the cultural revolution of the Black Power era, the subtle call for the rejection of the culture of racism, patriarchy, and warmongering was evident in this earlier moment and provides another connective tissue. My project can be thought alongside at least three others: Dale Gore's Radicalism at the Crossroads, Van Goss's Rethinking the New Left and Interpretive History, and Terence Renaud's New Lefts, The Making of a Radical Tradition. In her exploration of radical Black women's long-distance organizing from the 1930s to the 1960s, Gore argues that neat frameworks can't fully capture the politics of the cadre of women she studies. In focusing on points of contact and exchange through what she calls a collective political biography, she's able to more fully capture continuities and resonances in their thinking, theorizing, organizing, and networks. I seek to likewise track a longer and more robust history of radical Black anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist intellectuals and political thought and theorizing. My approach is also informed by Goss insofar as he calls for a longer, broader view of radicalism in the United States during the Cold War, which problematizes not only decades, i.e. the 1960s, as closed historical containers, but also any easy bifurcation of the old and new left. Finally, Renaud argues that there are multiple new lefts dating back to the interwar period that offer a prehistory of the 60s new left in their radical attempts to transcend capitalist, imperialist, and authoritarian domination. While the uppercase new left is the domain of the 1960s, he contends, new lefts have abounded through confrontations of the aforementioned problems for decades. Thinking with Renaud, then, Black radicalism in the McCarthyist conjuncture, which followed the upheaval of World War II, would be considered a new left. So the continuities in radical Blackness in the McCarthyist conjuncture in the Black Power era make sense in that both are new lefts. This framing also accounts for resonances between radical Blackness in the 1930s, what he dubs the anti-fascist new left, and the McCarthyist conjuncture for the same reason. While Renaud's intervention is set to work by the intersections of class and generation, I'm preoccupied with the intersection of anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist ideas, anti-radical state repression, and radical Black praxis. According to Robert Allen, there were at least 5 enunciations of Black power across the ideological spectrum. Black power as capitalism, Black power as more politicians, Black power as group integration, Black power as control of Black communities, and Black power within the context of a US revolution. Following this typology, I engage Black power as the political, social, and cultural formation at the intersection of the possibility of structural transformation, self-determination, and Black liberation on the one hand, and co-optation, repression, and alienation of Black people on the other hand. In the wake of the inadequacy of the civil rights movement in addressing the material conditions of poor, working class, and lumpen Black folks, Black power became more than a mere slogan, but less than a cohesive ideology that framed the organizing, activism, discourse, and aesthetic practices of Black movement throughout the mid-1960s to the late 1970s. The Black power in which I'm interested is what Allen calls Black power 2, that is, Black power through the lens of Black people as an internal colony and as part of the overall struggle of national liberation in the Third World. The characterization of the Black community in the United States as a nation and later an internal colony or neo-colony combined internationalism, anti-imperialism, and a critique of capitalism. According to this theory, the character of the oppression of Black people in the United States is akin to that of colonies of European imperial powers. Shared characteristics include exogenous ownership, comprador collaboration and identification with the oppressor for personal gain, and resources, including labor, extracted from the colonized community. It is a system of super exploitation understood as a process by which extra economic coercion is applied to the racially identified colonized group, in this case, Black people, with the aim of increasing the economic resources appropriated by the colonizers. Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton state plainly, quote, Black people in this country form a colony, and it is not in the interest of the colonial power to liberate them. They stand as colonial subjects in relation to the white society. Thus, institutional racism has another name, colonialism, end quote. Here, Black power enunciates a nexus of anti-colonial struggle, the call for general revolution in the United States, and the overthrow of capitalist racism and its internal logic of Wall Street imperialism and wars of aggression. As Eldridge Cleaver explained in 1968, quote, we recognize the problem presented to Black people by the economic system, the capitalist economic system. We repudiate the capitalist economic system. We recognize the class nature of the capitalistic economy, and we recognize the dynamics involved in the capitalist system. At the same time, we recognize the national character of our struggle. We recognize the fact that we have been oppressed because we are Black people, even though we know this oppression was for the purpose of exploitation. We have to deal with both exploitation and racial oppression, and we don't think you can achieve a proper balance by neglecting one or the other, end quote. The rejection of capitalist exploitation and its endemic processes of racial subjection was a critical feature of Black power politics that bridged space, i.e. North and South, but also time, i.e. seemingly discrete historical conjunctures. This is especially evident in mobilization and analysis, local and internationalist, around capitalist exploitation and US imperialism. It is here that Claudia Jones's analysis of self-determination in the Black Belt during the McCarthyist conjuncture shares similar features with the Black Power era theory of internal colonialism. Advocating for what she saw as the Communist Party's most effective weapon against the imperialist ideology of white supremacy, Jones argued that Black people in the heart of the Black Belt were a nation oppressed by US imperialism. While Black people in the Black Belt share the characteristics of a nation based on common language, culture, territory, and economic life, it was the latter and its concomitant social relations that pointed most starkly to their national character. In other words, the super exploitation of sharecroppers, the inferiorized condition of Black people in Northern and Southern industry, the structural realities of Jim Crow, and police brutality in urban ghettos all stem from the fact that Black people were an oppressed nation within US borders. It was true, she noted, that the national character of Black oppression posed linked but distinct problems for the US North and South. For Blacks in the North, whose problems were akin to those of an oppressed national minority, the fight was for equal rights and was primarily being waged by the presence of a large and growing Black proletariat that provided the critical link between the broader working class and the toilers in the Black Belt. In the South, by contrast, the struggle was for emancipation, to wipe out the economic, political, and social survival of slavery emanating from Wall Street imperialism, and to enforce equal rights through the exercise of the right to self-determination. Self-determination, though, did not exclude the struggle for partial demands that aided the class struggle against exploitation. Furthermore, the objective reality of workers in the Black Belt demonstrated that they desire self-determination, that they abhorred their super-exploited status under Jim Crow, and that the ideology of white supremacy denied them full freedom and equality. Failure to acknowledge this reality was to deny the obligation of the working class to struggle for conditions in which Blacks could make their own choice regarding national liberation. Given this objective reality, the Black struggle was fundamentally a revolutionary struggle against national oppression and for the right to self-determination in the Black Belt. Joseph's position was predicated on a revision of the CPUSA's Black Belt thesis between 1928 and 1930 that resulted from a heated debate concerning the lived realities of Blacks in the South. The 1930 resolution argued that Northern Black folks were involved in a struggle for integration and assimilation, while the demand for self-determination was to be applied to the South. But the quest for racial equality, irrespective of region, was a revolutionary demand. The realities of Wall Street imperialism elicited the urgent need for self-determination in the South as one expression of the struggle for complete social equality everywhere. The term McCarthyism is commonly used to denote the years 1950 to 1954, during which the eponymous Wisconsin senator wielded considerable influence and power in Congress and was instrumental in fomenting national anti-communist hysteria. However, the multifaceted Red Scare and its particular criminalization of Black communists and radicals both preceded and exceeded that very short era. The McCarthyist conjuncture thus describes a political and discursive time space during which communism and adjacent or related forms of radicalism were seen as uniquely threatening to America's survival, so much so that measures that might otherwise have been considered a serious violation of individual rights were justified on the grounds of national security. The criminalization of radical ideas, political beliefs, and/or ideological formations was normalized in the service of maintaining a system of capitalist exploitation rooted in racial hierarchy. I've been considering how to name this phenomenon for quite some time. In the article, Constructing Deportable Subjectivity, I refer to this regime of repression as the McCarthyist structure of feeling, during which numerous radicals were indicted, deported, incarcerated, surveilled, and forced underground. In the article, And Battle for Peace During Scoundrel Time, I used the Cold War state apparatus as a framework, which combined what Louis Althusser called the ideological state apparatus and the repressive state apparatus. I described it as a nexus of government organizations, entities, and instrumentalities that inform the pedagogy of the Cold War state, discourses of un-Americanist, anti-Americanist, subversion and sedition, and related forms of criminalizing radicalism. So now I'm using McCarthyist conjuncture, all of that to say that like this terminology is up for grabs. I'm not wedded to any of it in terms of sort of intellectual propriety, but rather really trying to get at the most precise and specific language to describe the dynamics under study. So the McCarthyist conjuncture included anti-radical repression, imposition, and hostility from all three branches of the U.S. government. Executive branch actors and instrumentalities included the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, Executive Order 9835, or the Loyalty Oath of 1947, and the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. The legislative branch set to work committees and boards, including the House Committee on Un-American Activities, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and the Subversive Activities Control Board. It also unleashed old and innovative new legislation like the Foreign Agent Registration Act of 1938, the Hatch Act of 1939, the Alien Registration Act or the Smith Act of 1940, the Voorhees Act of 1940, the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, the Internal Security Act or McCarran Act of 1950, and the Communist Control Act of 1954. Regarding the judicial branch, a key Supreme Court case was Dennis v. the United States, argued in 1951, which upheld the Smith Act convictions of Communist Party leaders. During this conjuncture, a variety of institutions, agencies, actors, and interests were invested with political power at the federal, state, and local levels to target myriad forms of radicalism, including various anti-capitalisms, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, internationalism, peace activism, labor and union militancy, and struggles for Black liberation. Discourses of subversion, sedition, insurrection, un-Americanism, threats to internal and national security, foreign inspiration, deception, disloyalty, authoritarianism, and nefarious elements sowing division and confusion lent to an atmosphere of fear, distrust, hostility, and conformity. This repressive apparatus had a dialectical relationship with the production of an astonishing amount of radical and counter-hegemonic thought, including critiques of capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, war, the fascist character of anti-communist repression, triple oppression, and more. In a parallel fashion, Black power happened against the backdrop of political dissent, turbulence, and violence that served as a pretext for the extraordinarily as a pretext for the extraordinary repression and law and order policy and practice aimed at crushing opposition to the Vietnam War, Black militancy, and the ubiquitous youth counterculture. Likewise, the offensive of newly decolonized nations and their willingness to cooperate with socialist powers or refusal to align with either pole of the Cold War represented an international challenge to U.S. Racial capitalist society. Despite the fact that the central focus of Black power was not to overthrow the U.S. government per se, that violence was not the prevailing force in widespread protests, and that FBI police informants were heavily involved in inciting violent incidents, race riots, and urban rebellions. Militant Black organizations and struggles against the draft and the war continued to be construed as menaces to the prevailing order. The result was a calculated campaign by high-ranking officials in the executive branch and by Congress to intimidate and repress dissident activity. This calculated campaign had a large swath of support in civil society. The consensus at the time was that any excess was permissible in the name of forestalling Black revolution, especially given the continued discourse of communist plots to undermine the U.S. war effort, communist aggression, communist and extremist elements, and close links between foreign communists and domestic dissidents. For example, for a brief period in 1968, in the midst of urban riots that engulfed the nation after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th of that year, the notorious Subversive Activities Control Board, or SACB, was revived through a bicameral bill that gave the SACB the power to simply list by fiat groups found to be communist action or communist front organizations. As well, the House Committee on Un-American Activities issued a report urging the construction of concentration camps authorized by the McCarran Act to temporarily imprison warring guerrillas, i.e. radicals and Black groups that were seriously considering the possibility of instituting armed insurrection and planning guerrilla-type operations against the government. J. Edgar Hoover was active during the McCarthyist conjuncture in demonizing Blackness, radicalism, and radical Blackness, and he continued in this fashion during the Black Power era until his death in 1972. He claimed that communists and subversive and extremists strive ceaselessly to precipitate racial trouble and to take advantage of racial discord in this country. Not unlike during the McCarthyist conjuncture, challenges to the racial and economic status quo during the Black Power era were overdetermined by discourses of outside agitation, foreign inspiration, and subversion. Just one second, sorry, my baby is, she is participating in the conversation. There you go. Okay. Indeed, as Allen wrote in Black Awakening in Capitalist America, it was stagnating and deteriorating economic conditions in urban areas, despite the passage of the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act that incited rebellion and the call for Black power. He explained, quote, "It is in these economic figures that one sees clearly the genesis of urban rebellion. For poor Blacks, North and South, the civil rights movement accomplished virtually nothing besides raising false hopes. The promised salvation was not forthcoming, and explosion was inevitable," end quote. It is for this reason that looting was a big part of these rebellions. Poor Black people were reclaiming merchandise that had been stolen from them through low wages and price gouging. Though, according to Allen, these rebellions were largely unorganized and spontaneous, their political nature was in the challenge to capitalist racism generally and localized conditions of super exploitation and oppression in their communities particularly. Likewise, the Black uprisings which were a reflection of Black self-determination, were construed by the government as equivalent in terms of their subversive character to communist plots. In a 1967 address to the Organization of Latin American Solidarity in Havana, Cuba, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leader Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, argued that these rebellions brought together the real revolutionary proletariat ready to fight by any means necessary for Black self-determination by exposing and rejecting not only racism, but also economic exploitation and the control of Black communities by imperialist powers. He also emphasized that the politics undergirding urban rebellions were international in scope. Similarly, in 1968, Kathleen Cleaver, Communications Secretary of the Black Panther Party, compared U.S. Black rebellion in the service of wresting their communities from the control of the capitalist racist power structure to the Vietnamese fight to protect their country from racist American government control. Her analysis resonated with that of organizations like the Civil Rights Congress, which connected the lynch rope and the jelly bomb, in other words, the realities of anti-Black and anti-radical repression and the Korean War. Police occupation, attacks, and repression, Cleaver argued, were attempts to destroy Black leaders who were seeking to organize the Black masses to build power and to ultimately control their communities. Quote, just as the U.S. Army is attempting to settle a political question of self-determination through force and violence in Vietnam, Cleaver analyzed, quote, the city, state, and federal governments across the country are meeting political dissent with police violence, end quote. Likewise, Cleaver contended that because U.S. imperial power was under assault in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, state power in the form of militarized police was being deployed domestically against Blacks, radicals, and oppressed people who challenged the economic and political power of the white ruling class. As was the case during the McCarthyist conjuncture, each branch of the U.S. government was active in the suppression of radical Black ideas and organizing. In the 1970 hearings on assaults on law enforcement officers conducted by the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, for example, there were several references to the rebellions being communist-inspired, the Black Panther and other radical Black organizations being Uncle Toms to white communists, communist agitators infiltrating racial disturbances, and the identification of Black urban rebels with a third world type of communist efforts. Excuse me, just a second. Okay. Sorry, y'all. This is my daughter. This is Sankara. Say hello. Say hi. Okay. Authorities directly linked these imagined communist machinations to ostensible Black plots to foment revolution in the United States. Those who testified that Black rebellions were not solely a matter of communism and who suggested racial unrest might stem from issues other than communistic motivation, inspiration, guidance, or control, nonetheless took pains not to minimize the extent to which communists would like to bring about the downfall of the United States. The Senate Internal Security Subcommittee testimony construed struggles for Black liberation as vectors of subversion, sedition, and un-American influence. U.S. government officials linked the communist threat abroad, especially in the Third World, to the latest dimension of the communist threat at home: Black political violence in the form of guerrilla tactics, clashes with authority, and fundamental challenge to racial and economic hierarchy. That by 1972, nearly 500 local Red Squads that understood themselves as the most effective political force in blocking radicalism, student demonstrations, of Black power, were gathering political intelligence about these dissident groups attest to the continued influence of anti-radical repression and creating policy aimed at neutralizing Black rebellion. A powerful linkage between the McCarthyist conjuncture and Black power was the FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO. The program was a means for the FBI to address the threats from militants of the New Left, as it had those from the communists in the 1950s. And employed traditional investigative techniques of counterintelligence to counteract so-called domestic terrorism and conduct investigations of individuals and organizations who threatened so-called terroristic violence. These techniques and counterintelligence included illegal wiretapping, bugging, break-ins, frame-ups, and informant infiltration, harassment, and disruption campaigns. All in all, the FBI launched at least 2,218 individual COINTELPRO actions against groups and individuals, primarily radicals and a disproportionate number Black, between 1957 and 1971. In 1965, President Johnson encouraged Hoover and the FBI to intensify its investigation of general racial matters, which it did through COINTELPRO, which significantly was created during the McCarthyist conjuncture in the form of the Communist Infiltration Program, or Common Phil, to neutralize the CPUSA. Soon tasked with reporting on all civil rights matters, planned racial activity, racial conditions in urban areas, and Black nationalist groups, Hoover and COINTELPRO greatly exaggerated the communist influence in these areas at the same time that it kept up its attacks on the CPUSA. By August 1967, so-called Black nationalist hate groups became the primary target of COINTELPRO with the intent to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize leaders, organizations, spokesmen, and supporters in the Black liberation movement. In 1968, Hoover reiterated that the goal of the program was to undermine coalition and solidarity among militant Black nationalist groups, prevent the rise of a new messiah who could unite militant Blacks, stop these groups from gaining respectability, and to prevent their growth among and influence over the youth. Further, the FBI instructed 41 field divisions to implement COINTELPRO against organizations in major cities in the United States. From the program's inception to 1971, over 2,300 known proposals for disruptive activities were approved by the FBI. COINTELPRO also included the formation of the Ghetto Informant Program, which had nearly 7,500 stool pigeons by 1972. Additionally, COINTELPRO strove to mute Black internationalism, and this was a very important component in maintaining U.S. supremacy over the Third World. Black Power organizations were a central target of COINTELPRO. As has been extensively documented, the BPP suffered the most intense COINTELPRO surveillance, harassment, and repression. This was because, more than other groups COINTELPRO sought to destabilize, the BPP was considered, quote, an important phase of communist operations in the United States, end quote. Such connection was made plausible by its close relationship with the communist giant William Patterson, who was the lead architect of the We Charge Genocide petition, which was on the BPP's reading list. The praise they lavished on Patterson in the BPP newsletter, Patterson's reciprocal praise of the BPP and its leader Huey P. Newton, the BPP's ongoing analysis of U.S. genocide drawn from the petition, and its encouragement of comrades to take the issue of Black genocide before the United Nations. The break that occurred between Patterson and the BPP in 1972 did nothing to quell the government's contention that the BPP was effectively a communist front organization, made all the more dangerous by their focus on Black liberation. According to its co-founder, Huey P. Newton, the BPP was founded in Oakland, California in 1966, amidst the clamor for social justice, as an organization by and for Black and poor people. By the early 1970s, the party embraced the ideology of revolutionary intercommunalism, and it was targeted precisely because of its political ideology and its ability to organize masses of oppressed and exploited peoples. Revolutionary intercommunalism was an explicitly socialist ideology predicated on the idea that the United States has ceased to be a nation state and had become an empire by globally expanding its technical, military, economic, political, cultural, and social forms of control. All peoples and nations were conscripted into its dispersed and expansive project of expropriation and labor exploitation. As such, decolonization and revolutionary nationalism in and of themselves were insufficient because it was impossible to return to a state of former existence. Revolutionary intercommunalism emplaced the struggles of African descendants amongst other unemployables of the world, including third world and poor peoples. Together, the historical task of the dispossessed was to seize power, redistribute wealth, socialize labor, and realize communism as the highest stage of development. Likewise, these communities should determine their own destinies and develop cultures that were human-centered as opposed to dehumanizing and destructive. In effect, it was a force against reactionary intercommunalism, or the hoarding of land, labor, resources, and technology by imperial powers. Survival programs, or programs addressing the denigration of Black people that were meant to enable people to meet their daily needs by developing positive institutions within their communities and to organize the communities politically around these programs, was a strategy for achieving revolutionary intercommunalism. This combination of radical ideology and Black empowerment animated Hoover's claim that the BPP's free breakfast programs were the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. Savia Bukhari, member of the Harlem chapter of the BPP from 1969 until she was forced underground in 1974, explained, quote, COINTELPRO was designed to neutralize the party. It was an all-encompassing program from coast to coast. On December 4th, 1969, it culminated in the death of Fred Hampton in Chicago, and in that same year, Geronimo Pratt was incarcerated in California. Shootouts in New Orleans and Detroit, all across the country, the party offices were under attack, end quote. In word and deed, the BPP was the embodiment of radical Blackness, and as such, Hoover considered the BPP, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. Schooled in Marxist-Leninist ideology and the teachings of Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong, its members have perpetrated assaults on police throughout the country. Leaders and representatives of the Black Panther Party travel extensively all over the United States, preaching the gospel of hate and violence, not only to ghetto residents, but to students in college, universities, and high schools as well, end quote. The target of 223 of the 295 Black national COINTELPRO actions, Panthers were subjected to constant surveillance, beaten, raided, arrested, convicted on trumped up charges, and murdered. Additionally, the BPP was subjected to intense and ubiquitous disruption campaigns to sow dissent in the organization, often with deadly outcomes. As Dhoruba Ben Wahad, a victim of the 1969 New York Panther 21 conspiracy case disclosed, quote, COINTELPRO had devised a plot to incite the national leadership of the Black Panther Party to assassinate me and some of my comrades. There was, in fact, a counterintelligence program aimed at creating a split between the New York Black Panther Party and the BPP national headquarters. The FBI wanted to sow suspicion in the minds of national leadership, specifically Huey P. Newton, David Hilliard, and the Central Committee in Oakland, California, that the New York Black Panther Party members were out to kill them. They would also capitalize on individual differences, on sexism or regionalism within the Black Panther Party, end quote. These efforts to incite discontent within the party were effective. Describing his reason for leaving the BPP, world-renowned political prisoner Mia Abu-Jamal reflected, quote, I felt that it was proper to fight the system, but when the system can manipulate you into fighting your own, then the system wins and the people lose. I think that the period encompassing the fight between the East Coast and West Coast Panthers really reflected the destruction of the party as a national presence, because once it was split between coasts, then for all intents and purposes, it lost its effectiveness. It was no longer a united Black political revolutionary organization trying to achieve Black power, Black revolutionary political power, end quote. Moreover, supporters of the BPP were intimidated to cease financial support, disallow Panthers to use their facilities, and to disavow any action on their behalf. Such tactics were consonant with the forms of state violence between 1945 and 1951 documented in We Charge Genocide, a document that influenced SNCC as it protested the Vietnam War and experienced increasing attack by the FBI, and confirmed its analysis. The connections were so clear that the March 1970 Emergency Conference to Defend the Rights of the Black Panther Party to Exist, held in Chicago, Illinois, in the aftermath of the slaying of BPP leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, quote, said revival of the genocide set revival of the genocide petition high on their agenda. And William Patterson himself led the session that endorsed unanimously a resuscitation of the genocide initiative, end quote. So that was just some context, or some context comparing what I call the McCarthyist conjuncture and the Black Power era. So they're connected by things like state repression, the realities of U.S. imperialism, war, so Vietnam War in the context of the Black Power era, and the Korean War in the context of the McCarthyist conjuncture. And we see that all of these are permeating the analysis of the different thinkers under study. So I'm particularly interested in the modes of thought and theorizing in the McCarthyist conjuncture and Black Power conjunctures that enunciated the outright rejection of capitalist racism and Wall Street imperialism and its numerous structural effects and the envisioning of an anti-racist socialist future. While studies like Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy, published in 1944, and the 1968 Kerner Commission report reduced economic disparities between Blacks and whites to racist attitudes and values, radical Black thinkers place paramount importance on economic empowerment, independence, and redistribution, and far less emphasis on changing the hearts and minds of white folks. Black women's analysis of their racialized, gendered, and economically exploited realities conveys the linked theorizing and analysis. The eminent Black communist Claudia Jones analyzed their unique relationship to the mode of production of the labor market that produced social relations, reducing them to absolute other. In the 1949 Public Affairs article, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, Jones concluded that the empowerment of Black women should be prioritized because, given their special form of subjection, they were the most militant and therefore the most essential to socialist revolution. She wrote, quote, the bourgeoisie is fearful of the militancy of the Negro woman, and for good reason. The capitalists know that once Negro women undertake action, the militancy of the whole Negro people, and thus the anti-imperialist coalition is greatly enhanced, end quote. Anticipating arguments of the Black Power era and Third World feminism, Jones contended that while Black women experienced multifaceted forms of oppression, race was the primary mode through which super exploitation was experienced. Quote, the Negro question in the United States is prior to and not equal to the woman question. For the progressive women's movement, the Negro woman, who combines in her status the worker, the Negro, and the woman, is the vital link to the heightened political consciousness, end quote. Moreover, Black women's responsibility as partial or sole breadwinner, treatment in the labor market, and active participation in the social, political, and economic life of the Black community rendered them the real active forces, the organizers, and the workers. 2 years earlier, in February 1947, Thelma Dale documented the status of Black women in the United States in a report given at an International Council meeting in preparation for an upcoming convention of the Women's International Democratic Federation, an international peace organization that had formed 2 years earlier at a gathering in Paris that Dale had attended. Her report, which opens with the statements that Black women, quote, face the double oppression of both racial and sexual discrimination, end quote, described the specific effects of anti-Black discrimination on Black women. One key cause she identified is that the majority of Black women were forced to seek wage labor outside the home because their husbands don't earn money to support their families. Black women's material realities meant that they struggled to find equality with both white women and Black men. Though Black women had been afforded some opportunities to perform industrial labor during World War II, they had been steadily pushed back toward domestic service in the context of post-war demobilization. Their conditions were exacerbated by the fact that they were woefully underrepresented in trade unionism. Moreover, with an eye to bringing international attention to the horrors of segregation, Dale also detailed the disenfranchisement of Black people in the U.S. South, one result of which is that Black women were nearly absent from government posts. White supremacists were escalating the violence against and lynching of Black people, both men and women, trying to terrorize them into not voting. She concluded that strengthening the struggle against fascism and for peace and democracy, with a particular eye toward raising awareness about the plight of Black women, will help to resolve their situation. The intellectual ground cleared by Jones and Dale was sown by radical Black feminist thinkers during the Black Power era in organizations including the Combahee River Collective, the Third World Women, and the Third World Women's Alliance. They fitted the double, triple oppression exploitation analytic to their socio-historical and material conditions. The CRC was not only opposed to race, class, and sex discrimination, but also to heterosexism. They saw as their intellectual and historical task the development of a praxis that challenged the interlocking systems of domination that particularly played women of color, and that built upon the historical struggle of Black women against the antagonism of white male rule. As Black working women, they rejected the racism, elitism, and sexism of the mainstream and leftist movements and organizations that peripheralized their unique experiences of exploitation and oppression. Moreover, the CRC coined the term identity politics to denote a, quote, repugnant, dangerous, threatening, and therefore revolutionary, end quote, set of discursive and political practices that centered their own strivings for socialist liberation. Like Jones and Dale, this group of militants believed that socialism was imperative to Black women's empowerment because, quote, work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work and create the products, and not for the profit of bosses. Sorry, my alarm went off. Material resources must be equally distributed among those who create these resources, end quote. However, such a revolution must also be feminist and anti-racist to ensure that the specific class position of Black women was accounted for. In a document called Black Women's Manifesto, Maxine Williams and Fran Beal of the TWWA also employed an anti-capitalist analysis, pointing out that Black women continue to be overrepresented in non-unionized and service-based occupations, which transmuted them into a supply of surplus and cheap labor that was remunerated terribly, denied workforce advancement, restricted to the most exploitative forms of labor, and excluded from or subordinated in unions. Along with being, quote, economically exploited as a worker, being used as a source of cheap labor because she is female, and being treated even worse because she is Black, end quote, Williams pointed to the double exploitation of Black women working in someone else's private household and then having to take care of their own. Beal added that Black women were forced to work in white people's kitchens because Black men were often foreclosed from the labor market, and these material demands resulted in turmoil in Black family structures and the disruption of Black relationships. So there she sounds a lot like what Thelma Dale was arguing in 1947. Moreover, Black women had the burden of caring for white folks' children before tending to their own, a structural reality that lent to the ideological denigration of Black women who were misconstrued as the arbiters of Black family dysfunction. Black women's specific forms of domination were compounded by a multitude of factors. Like Dale, she noted that both poor and middle-class women disproportionately worked outside of the home and headed households. Additionally, like Jones, Williams and Beale pointed out that Black women saw their oppression as a national question as opposed to one that was primarily determined by gender. This was largely due to white women's myopia, racism, and ignorance of the plight of their darker sisters. So to conclude, this project is modeled after a book by Julius Lester called Revolutionary Notes. It's this book, and it's just kind of like it's really good. I really recommend that people check it out. It's gives a wonderful overview of like the mid 1960s moment in a number of essays. And so likewise, I want to engage the continuities and resonances through a series of short essays. Methodologically, I employ archival research and close reading to compare and analyze one expression of intellectual and political thought, whether newspaper articles, pamphlets, petitions, organizational objectives, and the like, from each of the conjunctures. So that is sort of an overview and some insight into the project that I'm thinking about currently. There's still some sort of things I'm thinking about around temporality. I think the conjunctural analysis helps to sort of, because people categorize the old and new left differently. Like, for example, some argue that like the 1950s is the start of the new left, which sort of is different than how I'm thinking about it. But part of the reason why this project I think is important is because oftentimes in the United States, the primary period of radicalism people think about is like the 60s and 70s, or this Black Power moment. And part of what I want to do by putting that era in conversation with this McCarthyist conjuncture is to convey that there's much more radicalism out there from which we can draw, and that the 60s didn't happen in a vacuum or a bubble, that there are antecedents to what was happening then, and also some deep resonances and parallels that might also help us inform our current moment. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Charisse. So that's great. So we have about half an hour, 40 minutes for questions and answers. Your baby's incredibly well behaved.
Thank you. Don't jinx it. I'm glad I have my headphones in. She can't hear you. She'll take that as license to not be.
So it would be great if you could switch your cameras on, so we have a seminar feel to everything, rather than just blank screens. I mean, don't feel obliged to, but that would be nice. So over to you. If you need to raise your hand electronically, I think, for me to actually see it. So contributions, questions, observations. Well, perhaps I'll start with just to kick things off. So in the UK context, of course, I think this thing about the new left, I think it is associated with a particular moment in history. I mean, basically, I think the Hungarian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, and the British journal New Left Review emerged out of, I think there was a journal called New Reasoner, which was developed by people who were disillusioned with the British Communist Party and what they considered to be Stalinism. And 2 or 3 publications eventually came together and formed what we now call New Left Review in the early 1960s. So that's I think how that sort of concept is understood pretty much in the UK context. So I don't know how that translates over into the US. Well, that's interesting, actually. I don't whether the expression's used in the same way in the US context, or it sounds from what you were saying that you've got your own take on that.
Yeah, I think that so that 1956 moment, especially like the Khrushchev revelations, when there was like a mass exodus from the CPUSA, is also a founding an important moment. Also, there's like the 1954 Montgomery bus boycott, which is seen to have kicked off like the civil rights movement, is also seen. Some people mark that as a sort of articulation of a new left, because so part of that argument is that really like Black people become a major factor in the new left, but are not necessarily so in the old left. I push back against that, right? And especially I think if you look in and around like the Communist Party, there's a sort of small but really influential contingent within and around the Communist Party. If you look at even organizations like the Civil Rights Congress, or the National Committee to Defend Negro Leadership, or the Council on African Affairs. And so part of my looking at radical Black thought in these two moments is to sort of push back against this idea that a new left starts when like minorities become significant to political struggle, because obviously there's a long history. And so I think that I don't think the old and new left demarcations map neatly onto what happens in the UK context, because there's also other readings that would argue that like the 1960s is like the start of the new left, when sort of students and youth become the primary actors of revolutionary struggle. There's a shift in discourse from like exploitation and oppression to alienation and disempowerment. And there's these various things that happen. But I think the consensus is that there is a sort of hard break between old and new left. And I think that some of those distinctions are relevant, but can be overblown. And I think that sort of epistemologically, this emphasis on sort of difference and disjuncture comes at a particular historical moment, like a focus on those things. And I'm more interested in sort of continuity and unity, not to be ahistorical, but rather because those things are there. And that's what I sort of seek to set out to sort of prove. Yeah.
Thank you. It makes me wonder how much communication there was between people in Europe and the UK and the American radicals. That's an interesting issue. Right, so now we have 3 contributions. That's great. So CNM was first, I think Andy second, and Virginia third. So we'll take them in that order. CNM?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask something that also we are discussing sometimes in Turkey's, the same period in Turkey. You also said and Tony said in the last sentence that radicals, who designate them radicals, in this period? They themselves, the supporters, or the government? Because if so, the government, just we can understand. But what are the features of these radicals exactly? Because to whom? I just wanted to learn, because radical term is sometimes we are using in in some events, in this kind of events or some groups, but sometimes we get confused that who have to get designated as radicals. I wondered it. And also you also mentioned the problems of Black women during that period as in the last parts, and I think they still have this, because especially in since the 1980s, their intersectionality approach occurred by Kimberly, I forgot the name
Crenshaw.
of her. Yeah, Crenshaw. And we are studying also her approach that in academia as well, but it's still the many things that you have mentioned also still active, I guess, that Black women also in transnational feminism and global feminism debates as well. There is a distinction that transnational feminists always argue that, and they look also from the intersectional perspective, because they still have these struggles. I'm not quite whether something has changed, because during also the research about transnational feminism, I've read many things that they still have, low pay, they are low paid, still exploited in the labor market, or still very easy exposed to sexual harassment or whatever. You can see it very well in many of the, even in the movies or series or whatever. So also I wanted to hear your comment about today's Black women resistances and Black women demands, whether it has changed, the claims has changed, and whether everything is real. Thank you, by the way. It was really nice research.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'll start with the sort of last part first. So interestingly, I don't consider triple oppression to be like a precursor to intersectionality. Intersectionality, so and I say this with caution coming from the United States, because other parts of the world just got intersectionality, right? And so I think that it's still relatively sort of radical given the context. But here, what we have to understand about intersectionality is that intersectionality was an argument before the law. It was an argument about Black women not getting promotions at the Ford at the Ford Motor Company, right? And so class is not a protected category under the law. So it's really only about race and gender as well. It's about recognition and representation, whereas intersectionality, whereas triple oppression is objectively anti-imperialist and revolutionary. And so I make that distinction. Part of the reason why I lift up triple oppression is as another framework through which we might work to understand Black women's oppression and exploitation, because of the way that intersectionality, I think, it can be radical or revolutionary, but it's not objectively so. And that actually wasn't really the intent because of it's a sort of one enunciation of like of critical race theory, which is a legal thing. So there's much more. I've talked about this elsewhere, but that being said, you know, there's this saying that like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? Black women still suffer many of the same issues, not only Black women in the United States, but Black and oppressed and racialized women globally suffer from sort of the devalorization and super exploitation, as well as the sort of the denigration of reproductive labor. Those things are still ongoing. And so again, I think that triple oppression gives us a framework through which to understand like relationships to the mode of production and relationships to imperialism. That intersectionality, that's not really the project of intersectionality per se. With respect to who counts as a radical, the most of these people that I profile, like in the 60s, call themselves revolutionaries, right? But it's a sort of dialectical relationship between the state and between the revolutionary. So they're codified as radical or revolutionary in a pejorative sense by the state. And then because of the repression that emanates from that, it also sort of radicalizes people to push back against that designation. At the same time that the United States designates folks radical who are not so. So the NAACP was considered to be, you know, was touted as a communist front at one point, and there's nothing radical about, well, the national chapter of the NAACP, it's nothing radical about it, right?
That's
In fact,
why I'm asking, who says radical? Who are who to count radical? You know, just whether the government impose us to say them radical. Sometimes I'm questioning also this.
Right, but I think that radicals also see themselves as radical, right? Because, you know, as everybody says, radicalism means like deracination, lifting something up from the root. And I think that there are people who are fundamentally committed to structural transformation, and they understood themselves as radicals and as revolutionaries, not as extremists, right? Which becomes conflated in political culture, but as radicals, as people who are fundamentally dedicated to uprooting the status quo and building something new.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Sinem.
Thank you.
Andy, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. You had so much detail and so much content. It's just impressive, as is your work in general, I have to say. I mean, I think a couple of things, really. I would like you to say a little bit more, even earlier than the 1950s, because I know that you've covered this, right? But I mean, the sort of the Black communist tradition and the Communist International and the discussion with the revolutionaries, you know, from the period of the 1920s onwards is also, you know, the tradition is quite real going back through each decade. And in the 30s, the Communist Party really did organize in the South and so on. So I think even the 50s had, you know, where do you start and where do you stop? I know, but the conversation between Black revolutionaries and the Communist International, I think, is in itself very interesting. I also think that, I mean, I agree with your comments about intersectionality. I'd be very interested how you think the analysis historically, the ideas which you're bringing back to us, how much that informs the debate about racial capitalism, because I mean, that is, you've got real content to it, I think. And finally, I just want to say, if you haven't seen the book about Claudia Jones, The Left of Marx, you should really read it. It's so, Claudia Jones is a major figure here in Britain in terms of founding the Black movement here. And she is buried for Left of Marx, so you can go and visit her as well.
Yeah, Carol Bois Davies is actually one of my mentors, and so of course, like that was like the book, right? That, and then like my Eric McDuffie's Sojourning for Freedom were like two of the really important works on introducing like Black communist women to, like, you know, the mainstream, so to speak. You're absolutely, the 1920s and 30s are really, really important. I'm looking at, and part of what I am going to think through is connecting the McCarthyist conjuncture, so that 47-57 period, to this 1930s moment, right? Because, not least because this is how, you know, when you read like Harry Haywood's Black Bolshevik, or some of these, what is the one by Nell Irving Painter? sorry, I have brain fart. But anyway, you know, the sharecropper, his name will come to me. But anyway, people, when they're talking about the 1950s, they so often mention that Hosea Hudson. Thank you, Joel. They so often mention that 1930s moment, that immediate post-war World War II moment felt like the 1930s and was sort of a revival of the 1930s. So it is important. And so there is a project, sorry, you okay? See, somebody said you're well-behaved and now look at you. Anyway, so there is a project, right, to comparing like the 1930s moment to the 1950s to the that Black Power era. But so I take your point, and and so I hope to sort of slide some of that in, like Scottsboro, like Angelo Herndon, and you know, and even thinking about, for example, like Scottsboro as really the an initiating point of the civil rights movement, because of, not least because of the case law that came out of the Scottsboro trial. In terms of racial capitalism, it's funny. This is apropos of nothing, but I was just sitting in on this seminar giving some feedback on a volume that's coming out about Du Bois and political economy. And one of the arguments was about, you know, to argue that he's a sort of theorist of racial capitalism, which is something that I subscribe to, but I said no, right? Because I think that to make it more evergreen, the term racial capitalism would sort of date it. And even though I think that racial capitalism is an analytic that I find to be useful, it's also sort of this dangling signifier or this traveling theory at this point, where it comes to mean everything and nothing. And so, but I will say how I came to racial capitalism was through the theory of super exploitation, right? This conjuncture of oppression and exploitation, especially of sort of Black folks, and that particular relationship, that particular experience of exploitation over and above that of the white working class. So to me, you know, the Negro question, so to speak, right, and the question of self-determination were some of the earliest theorizing about what we now call racial capitalism. And so I take your point, and I think that, but because of the way that racial capitalism has just become everything and nothing, like, I myself, right, in my book, I talk about capitalist racism, but anyway, I myself am moving from like that framework, just because it's like, you know, diaspora, neoliberalism, or globalization, all these things, they just start to lose their meaning over time. So thank you so much.
No, that's very good.
Thank you for that. Virginia?
Thanks very, very much for your talk. I was just wondering, in your discussion of the 60s, do you think what significance do you attach to I suppose between civil rights movement, SNCC, Black Power, to the failure of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to be seated, to you know, Fannie Lou Hamer's efforts, and also those including Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, who were urging the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to not be seated. So I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
You know, I mentioned it is absolutely essential, and I don't focus on it enough. Thank you for lifting that up, because I think it is really important. And I think that it really does, the failure, not only the failure of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to be seated, but also the sort of the politicking that happened around that, I think, was another aspect of the disillusionment that led to a more militant stance by young folks, right? And so that's, thank you for bringing that up. It's something that I do need to think through more and focus on, in terms of that the aspects of Black Power that have to do with like the failures of civil rights. And I just, Bayard Rustin, I can't stand. Yeah, Bayard Rustin is just the worst. And whatever, you know, nobody is reducible to their best or their worst, but like, it's, you know, now that this Bayard Rustin film has come out, he's been being lifted up as this like radical, and it's just like Bayard Rustin was so backward on so many things, that including that. So thank you for lifting that up. I'm jotting that down as a note to really to include in my analysis, because you're absolutely right.
Thanks very much for your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. So do we have any more contributions, questions? I'll let you have a think about that. Well, so you mentioned actually the expression super exploitation a couple of times, and I know Andy is very interested in this. So I was just wondering, when you use the expression, do you have in mind Marini's concept, his way of thinking about the term, or how do you sort of cash that out, the concept of super exploitation?
So I have in mind Harry Haywood. So Harry Haywood to me is like the progenitor of, he's in the 1920s. So he's the primary architect of like the Black Belt Nation thesis, and he's one of the main thinkers. Him and Claudia Jones later on. And then there's a white fellow whose name is escaping me because I remember no names anymore. John something or other. He wrote the book Negro Liberation. They're some of the main architects of this term of thinking about super exploitation, especially in the Black Belt of the U.S. South. And so I really go back to those original sources. I know folks have more recent folks have developed thinking around super exploitation, and even people argue that like what's the man's name? David Harvey, right? His concept of like dispossession and expropriation are forms of super exploitation. I see those things as separate, but for me, it's Harry Haywood who's work and thinking. By the way, there's this collection, I think that just came out here of Harry Haywood's selected writings. That's really important. But I think that Harry Haywood gets sort of short shrift, but he's actually a super important radical Black thinker. Who is the other person you mentioned?
Well, Andy can perhaps comment.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a whole team working on it. I mean, John's written a very good book about imperialism and labor super exploitation as being like the key to sort of the neoliberal globalization moment, because manufacturing is now mostly done by super exploited workers in the global South. So, yeah, I mean, we are trying to build sort of a current, if you like, that the white and northern working class have to recognize the reality of super exploitation as a sort of a material basis of divisions in the working class. I mean, you can't unite the working class unless you recognize the real oppression which some sections have. And, what you're talking about, the national oppression, is the reproduction of imperialism inside the imperialist nation. I mean, that's what's going on. So they have their own particularity, but fundamentally, it's about the division of the world, which also divides the working class. So, we have lots of debates at the level of economics about super exploitation, but what it's really all about is politically to recognize oppression as the sort of like the necessary condition for uniting the working class. I would say. Yeah.
So I think yes, other people. It's interesting. There's certainly a revival of interest in the concept. A lot of work being done on that. But I noticed that Joel has contributed something. So Joel, do you want to actually say it, or I can read it out if you like? But if you don't mind saying it, then that would be great.
I'm listening. I'm just gonna go grab her pacifier, someone's off camera, but I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just suggesting that in We Charge Genocide, William Patterson and his researchers also explore the super exploitation issue as part of the economic element of genocide. So that was an essential piece of that argument.
Yeah, I wrote an article about this actually. We charge genocide as a critique of racial capitalism, and one aspect of which is the critique of super exploitation and expropriation. But yeah, so I 100% agree.
Okay, thank you. So, do we have any more questions, contributions?
I mean, the other really interesting point that I've heard Charisse make, which I do agree with, is, I mean, we're trying to connect, with Marx as well, right? Mm-hmm. So the whole question of the reserve army of labor is really important as well in terms of a sort of applying Marx's category to the condition of oppressed sections of the working class. I mean, the reserve army of labor is ghettoized or has been ghettoized in the United States. I don't know, Charisse, if you want to say anything about that, or is that part of your discussion?
Yeah, well, in my book, so I kind of repurpose the term of subproletariat. So I call, Black people the subproletariat, which includes not the reserve army and labor, but also this sort of, it's under literally sub the proletariat, right? Because Black people are largely sort of toilers and the servants of others. And so I think that that's absolutely right. There's a man called Clarence Mumford, who writes about the Reserve Army of Labor, that as a function of, really taking off in like, or as a structural feature in the 1970s, but obviously emanating from like the long history of enslavement, sharecropping, et cetera. So I think that the Reserve Army of Labor is absolutely right. What's interesting is also, then one has to take into account like incarceration, right? What does it mean so then they become a sort of captive, they're prisoners of war, really, right? If they're Reserve Army, then they become captive in the United States in the prison industrial complex. And so they become captive labor.
Yeah, that's very good.
Slaves. Yes, the amendment which is supposed to abolish slavery, I think, excluded workers in prisons, didn't it? It's sort of legally the only legitimate form of enslavement, which is sort of
correct. Yeah. Which it's interesting, right? Because there's this idea that prisons come about to reinstitute slave labor, right? But it's really to warehouse. But it's really a form of disaccumulation as well, right? It's to warehouse a potentially productive population. So it has this dual purpose of cheap, virtually free labor. It's really, really cheap labor. It's basically free. They make like 12 cents an hour. But it's also to warehouse a surplus labor, right? Because most people in prison don't work. They don't have jobs. So that I think that looking at both of those aspects is important with regard to like the explosion of incarceration in the context of the United States.
Okay, thank you. Andreas, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to contribute?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the fascinating talk. As you just also referred to the current prison complex, I mean, in your talk, you looked more at the historical traditions of radical Black thought. To what extent, in what way does the current Black Lives Matter movement draw on those historical experiences? Are there close connections, or are they appropriated in different ways?
I would say yes and no. I feel like it certainly sort of aesthetically, right? It draws on this history of Black radicalism. Black Lives Matter, and there's again, like the NAACP, for example, there are chapters that are extremely radical, and then there's a sort of national body that, and then these things shift over time, but Black Lives Matter national organization, I would not classify as radical now in terms of their goals, in terms of the what they're doing with like that massive amount of money, in terms of like the grifting that has happened in the name of Black Lives Matter. But I think that and also just the terminology, like we went from, BLM used to be Black Liberation Movement, right? We went from questions of power to questions of mattering. So I don't know. There's lots of critiques. So what I will say is that Black Lives Matter is expert at mobilizing and galvanizing. In terms of sustained organizing, I think it has not been that effective. And I will say, the movement is I would say more multifaceted, right? Because it takes into account things like sexuality, and gender, and other vectors that earlier movements did not. But as a radical entity, I'm ambivalent about it, right? I think progressive, sure, but as a radical sort of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist entity. And then there was like the Palestine solidarity aspect. So it's a mixed bag. But I think that in their minds, right, they're drawing on this broader Black radical tradition.
Okay.
How that actually looks on the ground, I don't know.
Thank you for that, Andreas. So, do we have any more questions?
Do you mind me just asking it very politically? I mean, your work is very political, right? How can the movement stop this happening again? I mean, all these strategies. I mean, the emergence of Black revolutionaries in the States is a threat for the US, isn't it? The US state. But so it's a really sort of huge issue. People's lives, people know this immediately. If you stand up, your head could be chopped off basically, or you could be persecuted. So it must be a huge challenge in practice to how to deal with this.
I think that if I had the answer to that, I would be in Guantanamo. I think that if I had the answer to, if anybody had the answer to this, we would be free. You know what I mean? And so I think it's ongoing because the nature of surveillance and harassment and repression shifts. We see it happening right now, not only in the United States, but globally. But I live in the United States with the pro-Palestine movements. If you look at what's happening at Columbia, Yale, Pomona, Vanderbilt, like we see the repression, and some of this stuff isn't even radical, right? There's divestment isn't about overthrowing the government, right? It's not really about structural transformation per se. These are really kind of liberal or maybe even progressive values, and yet they're calling in, people are clamoring to call in the National Guard against students in tents, right? And so I think that, to me, the best way we have to be much more organized than mobilized, right? We continue to mobilize and show up, but the durability and the discipline, I think, and the sort of actual mutual aid that comes with organization can be missing from these upsurges, which I think makes repression more effective. But we see in the moments in the organized sort of pushback against the police where they're able to de-arrest people, right? They're able to say the police are not able to arrest people because people are they're organized in strategies and tactics in terms of decarceration, for example. So I think we need much more people in organizations and more discipline and more proactive and not reactive forms of fight back. I think that those are the best ways to sort of push back against the repression, which is inevitable. But the thing is, they can't catch everybody. Like that's just an objective fact, right? They can't catch everybody. And again, and I think that the more that we sort of lean into that and think through what that actually means, I think also the more effective we can be. But it's difficult. You know, that's why that's why movements keep on being destroyed, you know, in whole or in part.
This thing about the meaning of the word radical, I think this is perhaps what Sinem was trying to get at earlier on. There's a sort of power struggle around the use of the term, and there's a sort of identification. Well, in a way, it's about the politics of identification, isn't it? The demonization of some people using a certain sort of language or discourse, like words like extremist or radical and so on and so forth, to justify repression, of course. So there is a sort of, in a way, it's a semantic issue, but of course it isn't just a semantic issue. It's a very significant political one as well. But the word itself is sort of, as you suggested, I think, is sort of, in a way, it's an empty placeholder. It requires content, and the question is who's going to give it the content, as it were, and who's going to take control over the language. I think that this is an interesting aspect of the process. I think the political process. Yeah.
I mean, I think the other side to that too is more people are claiming a sort of radical or revolutionary politic when they're just liberals, because from the left, we denigrate liberal or progressive forms of politics because they're not our politics. And even though I think ultimately liberalism is amenable to fascism, I don't think the two are the same. I push back against that argument, but I think liberalism is amenable to fascism. We see that happening in the US currently. But though I believe that to be true, I also think that we have to understand the historical and political situation, and that things are so bad that we need all hands on deck. And so liberals do it, like organizing people to vote. If we continue to sort of denigrate that form of organizing, then people are going to claim radicalism or revolutionary politics when that's not their politics, which then again, the people who do have those politics become these wild-eyed radicals, right? These extremists, these ultra leftists, right? By comparison. And so I think that we also need to have some political humility. And this is a time for big tent stuff, like for big tent organizing. Like if you think voting is going to help us, vote. If you think it's, mutual aid, do mutual aid. If you think it's, if your side of struggle is education, do that. But we really do need all hands on deck. And we can debate the merits of who got Marxist capital right when we're winning, right? When we are, when the historical forces have shifted. This is not the time. And so I think that until we realize that, we're going to continue to have 1,000 parties of 7 people, and and meanwhile the right, everything is up for grabs, right? The right wing, that is to say, everything is up for grabs, and they're winning. So anyway, yeah, I think that we all need to have political clarity, but also political humility about however we identify.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, okay, do we have any more? We're almost, well, we've only got 5 minutes or so, but if there are no more contributions, then I think perhaps we'll just thank Charisse in the usual manner for a really stimulating talk. Thank you very much, Charisse. And
Thank you for having me.
brilliant. I can just see the top of her head now. You're so well behaved. It's been,
Bye.
Okay, I'll end the meeting there. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks a lot. Bye.